Hello and welcome to another presentation by me. This time I will be looking at the history of communication. All right. So my focus in this presentation, I will start with the three fathers of communication or communication studies, Shannon's contribution to the field of communication. I will also look at the early studies that established the foundation of the study of communication, like earlier before the 20th century. And then I will give a summary of the British cultural studies, and then I will have a short critical analysis, which asks questions that I thought of as I was doing the assignment. Now, to start with the founding fathers of communication, according to Schramm, not only were these great producers in their own rights, but they were also great starters. In fact, Schramm, thought that the greater importance of these men may prove to be not what they themselves did, but what they got started. And I extracted this quote from Pulley 2018. The first of the three that I'll be looking into is Wilbur Schramm himself, who was the first academic to identify himself as a communication scholar. He was born in 1907 and died at the ripe age of 80 in 1987. He was a journalist, a writer, and of course, an academic. He founded the Iowa Writers Workshop in 1935 and was its first director in 1941. He was very influential in establishing communication as a field of study in the United States of America, where he went around literally opening the departments of communication in universities. And he did that all over the state. So he had a reason, like a vested reason, to want communication as a field to thrive. In fact, these three fathers of communication or founding fathers are based on his analysis. So it should be important for you to note. There are others, but only three he named. Right. So he first named Paul Felix Lazarsfeld, who again was his contemporary, slightly older than him, born in 1907 and died in 1976. He was a mathematician and a sociologist. And before I go on, I should also take note that these founding fathers of communication field were not wittingly founding fathers. It's not like they consciously thought that they would be, but it was just that Schramm put them together, and because of the work that they'd already done contributing to communication. So, for example, Paul Lazarsfeld was the founder of Columbia University Bureau of Applied Social Research. He developed the two-step theory of communication and based his on his findings. Actually, the majority of general public did not form their own opinions. So you've got the general public, and the general public don't normally form their own opinions. It goes two steps down. They listen to what are called opinion leaders. So just think about it, like in your family, your father or your mother can say something, but there's that sibling who often navigates how you think about a topic. And this is what Paul Lazarsfeld said, particularly to do with media. And then we've got the humble Carl Hovland. He was described as so by so many of his colleagues. He was an experimental psychologist. He pioneered the social communication and modification of attitudes and beliefs. And he carried out the first studies on persuasive behavior or communication, not behavior, communication. And he really strongly believed, like I actually do, that if media can change people's opinions and attitudes, then it can be an efficient tool for severe social issues like prejudices and stereotypes. So that puts a very big responsibility in the hands of media and how they communicate, how they talk about groups of people or events, and how many times they talk about it in order to persuade a specific audience. So that being answered, I will move on to Claude Shannon, who was also very instrumental in the contribution to the founding of communication studies. If you don't know about Claude Shannon, I'll just give you, he was a mathematician, and he was a well-renowned guy. He is actually contributed as well known as the father of information technology in the 20th to 21st century. So he was this mathematician, electrical engineer, computer science, and cryptographer. I would really recommend you go and look for him on YouTube and find a video about him. He was quite an eccentric character. He laid theoretical foundations for digital circuits today and information theory. And of course, what we call the mathematical communication model, which said that, between a message moving from an encoder to a decoder, there was noise or disruptions in between. And so it was important to understand those disruptions and how to mitigate them. I'll talk about his contribution in terms of how it was looked at from an analysis point of view. So the first point is that this theory does not account for communication's dynamic and complex nature. So you'll see that with Shannon, his was like a one-way street of communication from encoder to decoder with noise. And then it was someone else later on who then made it like a circle. Even though, of course, then the feedback loop. So yeah, he did not really consider, the co-construction of messages through negotiated dialogue and feedback loops. He also assumed that the sender and the receiver have the same understanding and interpretation of the message, which really, in as much as it talks about noise, he doesn't also look at the issues of language, culture, values, and beliefs. Remember, though, that Shannon was a mathematician and electrical engineer, not so much a social scientist. And the model does not address the challenges and opportunities of communication in the 21st century with the digital age, where communication is mediated by various technologies. But again, we should always remember what Schramm said. It's not so much what these guys produced, but what they started. So from his model of communication, from Shannon's model of communication, all these discussions were started. Then I would like to move forward to his contribution in current times. So when we look at the model of communication according to Shannon, it can still be a useful tool, especially if it's used critically and creatively to identify and define communication goals, objectives, and or strategies. So when you're using it, use it as a checklist to cover all the essential elements and factors of communication. Also, you can use the theory to adapt and modify it to fit specific situations and scenarios. Lastly, you can review and use the model to review and revise communication plans regularly to assess how well the goals are achieved. So moving on, so I think in my previous slide, I talked about the considerations, but these are the things that Shannon's communication model made us consider. So the source and the destination, of course, encoder, decoder. What is the message? So also think how the message is encoded and transmitted. Is it a call? Is it an email? Is it a letter? That also includes the channel and the medium that should be used. And how will the receiver decode and interpret it? Is someone else reading the letter for them, or they are going to read it? Is it going to be translated? Potential sources of noise that can affect communication. You can go further into looking at that. How feedback or interaction is incorporated into the process, and the digital technologies that can either enhance or hinder the communication. Moving forward, I would like to talk about the early studies or the foundations of communication. So I'm not going to really go in depth with these, but these are before the 21st century, going way, way back into like the times of the medieval period, like 400 to 1400 before Christ. And what is important is that to note is that the study of communication has largely been prompted by the current social issues of that particular time period, right? So you find that in the medieval period, the Greco-Roman culture was dominated by Christians, especially after the Roman Empire died. And the church at the time was they used to read the Bible to people. And you find that it was, pardon me, it was also very so they were very involved in the sharing of communication between people, particularly when it came to information, right? So they controlled what people read, listened to, and all that, and what was taught, right? So that was medieval times. And then from medieval times, we can move to the classical periods. And now in this time, which was 500 BCE to 400 BCE, to 400 CE, the formal study of communication began, and it began in Greece with the Greek theologians, or not theologians, Greek philosophers, Aspasia of Miletus, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Aspasia was a female, by the way. And yes, these have been known as maybe the forefathers and foremother of communication as a whole. From that classical period, we have the Renaissance, where the arts, and now institutions and government competed with the church for personal allegiance, and people wanted their own freedom. And the time people felt comfortable challenging the church's approach to education, and even how how people communicated. They wanted to communicate on their own terms, but for women, it was still a restrictive environment. And then lastly, the Enlightenment period. This was when the tensions between the church and the secular institutions lessened, and there was a transformation of the communication field as a reflection of broader cultural shifts. Furthermore, the printing press, which was made in Germany at the time, made the written word more readily available to the masses, plus a whole lot of other political issues that happened through newspapers and books. And then, of course, that changed the way people communicated and learned. And this was really the precursor to the Industrial Revolution. So how did communication field come about in the 20th century, and what was influenced? So remember, I did say that communication studies, or the field, was influenced by the issues of the time. So in the 20th century, letter writing became a thing because letters could go a long distance. Political debate started with new forms of leadership and governments, issues of persuasion, studies of persuasion, how people are persuaded, public speaking through speeches and political discourse, and even how preachers preached, and finally the education guided communication. So this led to a lot of communication advancements within the past 100 years than ever before in history. I am now moving on to my summary of the British Cultural Studies. Now, the British Cultural Studies was founded fundamentally as a transdisciplinary enterprise at its very conception, which went against the established academic institutional practices, and which more often than not neglected popular in favor of elite culture. So cultural studies insists that culture must be investigated within the social relations and systems in which it is produced and consumed. And that analysis of a culture is very bound up, or it's interwoven with the study of society, politics, and economic. So what we call the socio-economic and political sphere. So it's important to know the key scholars of this of the British cultural studies were Raymond Williams, Stuart Hall, and Richard Hawkins. All of these are known as cultural scholars, but they came from different venues: journalism, media, and sociology. And so I've already spoken about its interdisciplinary nature, and how it asserts that cultural practices must be researched within the parameters of social relations. And it's important also to know that it was influenced, but not limited to, traditions such as sociology, literary criticism, anthropology, and Marxism. Further, I want to talk about when a brief history on the BCS, the cultural studies. So this school, it's also known under the Birmingham School, right? So it emerged in the 20th century in the United Kingdom in Birmingham to focus on critical analysis of culture, media, and society. It started in the 1950s, but grew in the 1960s and 70s. And like I said, those were the influences: sociology, literary criticism, anthropology, as well as Marxism. What are the key aspects of British cultural studies? Cultural critiques, identities and representation, media and communication, cultural hegemony, subcultures and youth, semiotics and cultural significance, as well as reception studies and globalization. Now, in my reading about these few topics, I had a few, because we were supposed to really research on the history of communication. I was disturbed by my difficulty in finding literature from other parts of the world. So you do have what they call founding fathers of communication studies, but I think I suspected that there were other people from around the world who may have moved into analyzing communications as a field of study. And one thing that I maybe overlooked in mentioning is that those three fathers, or if you noticed, they are all from the American schools, but there was nothing from Africa, Egypt, Greater Africa, things like libraries from Timbuktu, or the South Asia, South America, Europe. And I thought actually the issue might be that there could have been a limitation of language, and therefore maybe that literature was not translated or has not been translated yet. Another thing I took note of was the total exclusion of female participation and contribution to the development and growth of communication as a field to study. There was also the issue of alternative communication styles, such as sign language, signals, and codes. And finally, it was quite interesting to take note as I was reading through the funding of researchers that it is important, as we noted in the second class, that that when we're studying communications, we look at specific events. But I also took note that these scholars, or the people who did do any research that had something to do with communication, were specifically funded by specific groups, and these groups have their interest in some places and not in others, or specific events, and that made selection of communication events only, it was only done for some and other events ignored. And those other events could have been just as equally important, but we'll never know. So thank you very much. These are the references that I used for reading and just getting to this information. If you want, you can always ask me for the list, but there it is. So thank you so much for listening to me. Have a great day.